is a regular joint meeting of the West Turlock Subbasin and East Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency Technical Advisory Committees. It's being held in person at 333 East Canal Drive here in Turlock at conference room 203. Members of the public may participate in the meeting and provide public comment in person or via the Zoom webinar feature or by telephone. As this is our first in-person meeting for a while, I figure we should do a round of introductions so we can remember who's who. So I'm start on my right with.
Good afternoon, all. Jennifer Land. I'm the Secretary for the Technical Advisory Committee of the West Turlock Subbasin.
I'm Michael Cook with Turlock Irrigation District. I'm the Chair of the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee.
Hi, everybody. I'm Herb Smart with TID, just TID.
I'm Christy McKinnon with Stanislaus County.
Adriel Ramirez with Merced County.
Matt Beeman, Merced Irrigation District.
Mike Tietza, GSP Coordinator for the East Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency.
I'm Sarah Wolf, Eastside Water District and Chair of the ETS GSA Tech.
Lacey McBride, Merced County.
Timothy Barahona, City of Modesto.
Miguel Alvarez, City of Modesto.
Debbie Montalbano. I'm with the TID and the Plan Manager for the Subbasin.
Karen Morgan, City of Ceres, Vice Chair of the West Turlock GSA.
Richard Lindo, Denair CSD. Mike Pitcock, City of Waterford.
Michelle Harris, Keys Community Services District.
Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to call the West Turlock to order. I see a representatives from TID, Stanislaus County, Merced County, City of Modesto, City of Ceres, Denair, Waterford and Hickman and Keys. So that's make that 8. Correct. So we need 7 to meet a quorum. So I'm calling this meeting to order. This is a joint meeting. So Sarah Wolf, representing the East Turlock GSA. Go ahead.
And likewise, we have representation from the East Turlock, from Stanislaus, Merced ID, and myself from Eastside Water District. So we have a quorum. So I'll call our board meeting together as well.
They were a little bit rusty. Okay, next on the agenda item number. Oh, sorry. Let's we have a number of people on the Zoom feature. You want to introduce yourself? You're very welcome to.
Hi, I'll start.
This is Milt.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Liz Elliott with Todd Groundwater.
I'm Milt Treeweiler, Turlock citizen.
I'm Arden Wells with Todd Groundwater.
Dominic Amador with Woodard and Curran.
Jessica Johnson, legal counsel for the ETS GSA.
And Phyllis Stanton with Todd Groundwater.
Wonderful. Thanks for participating, guys. So on to item number 3, public participation. This is the time set aside for members of the public to directly address the technical advisory committees on any item of interest to the public that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the technical advisory committees. You can, if you have an item on the agenda, you can wait till that agenda item is called, or you can make general comments now. So right now I'm opening public participation. Do we have any general public participation?
Yes, Michael, this is Milt Treeweiler, and I do.
Go ahead, Milt.
Okay, this is the time we've been waiting for. We have water this year, and it may be another, as we know, another 3 or 4 years before that occurs. And of course, this is the Subbasin GSA, so this is what we want to do, is recharge our subbasins. And this is what we've been waiting for. Now I hope we will be able to work out a system and a method where we can carry out the task of recharging the aquifer in the next 3 to 6 months or more. We're going to have plenty of water for 3 to 6 months. So we're going to have to use every step possible to recharge the aquifer, because we don't know how much longer, how many more years it'll be before we have water like this. So I just hope we all work together. We all keep an open mind, be open-minded, and think of ways and things that we can do, both East and West Subbasin, because we're one subbasin. There's no concrete barrier between the two subbasins. We need to work together we have TID, the West Basin has the water, but it's going to go out to the ocean if we don't use it. And I know we already have some projects that we are going to be selling water to the East Subbasin, but we need to maximize that every and any way we can. So let's work together and get the job done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Milt. We appreciate those comments. Anybody else from the public at this time? Okay, hearing none, I'll close public participation and go over to item number 4, which is approval of the minutes of the February 14th, 2023 special joint meeting of the West and East Turlock GSA Technical Advisory Committees. Those minutes have been sent out earlier. So at this time, I'd ask for motion from the West Turlock GSA TAC to either approve those minutes or any amendments you'd like to make.
Approve water.
Okay, so Waterford moves to approve the minutes as submitted. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
A second from Stanislaus County. Any further discussion? Okay, hearing none, so voice vote. So all those in favor of approving those minutes from February 14th, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstain? Minutes stand approved. Over to you, Sarah.
So we need to, on the East Turlock side, approve the same set of minutes from February 14th, 2023. Can I get a motion to approve?
I'll make the motion.
Thanks, Matt. Second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Christy. We have a first and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Okay, wonderful. So moving on to item number 5, budget update. I'm sad to report that Michael Clipper, the West Turlock Subbasin treasurer, cannot be at today's meeting. He did provide a recent budget update at the last week's West Turlock Subbasin board, a GSA board meeting for both the West Turlock and the basin as a whole. And if you have any information you want from Michael, please reach out to him via email. He'll provide that to you, but no update from the West Turlock today. Sarah? Turlock?
East Turlock, I'll just give you an account balance update. As of February 28th, East Turlock had $532,782.10 in its account.
Sounds good. Any questions of the budgets? Okay, hearing none, moving on to item number 6, the main event. This is the second annual report for the groundwater sustainability plan. So we'll review and discuss that this is for water year 2022, so last water year, and getting that ready for submittal to the Department of Water Resources. So I'm going to hand over to our consultants, Todd Groundwater and Woodard and Curran. Over to you guys.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Hi, my name is Liz Elliott. Like I introduced myself earlier, but Todd Groundwater. I am a senior hydrogeologist at Todd Groundwater, and I managed the development of this year's GSP annual report. This is the second annual report, and it is for the water year 2022. I will say it's so nice to see all of you in the same room, even though I'm still afar. One quick question, Jennifer, do you want me to share my screen or do you want me to kind of give you cues? I see that you've shared your screen with the PDF that we sent. What is your preference? Hello?
My apologies. Is this the information that you had planned on presenting as part of your presentation?
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to share my screen and go through the presentation from my end, or? Do you?
Certainly, yeah, I can stop sharing and you can do that if that's easier. Give me just a moment.
Sure, that would be great. Thank you. Give me one.
Okay, it's all yours.
Thank you. Give me 1 second and I'll share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Perfect.
Yeah, we can.
Great. Thank you. Okay, again, thank you everyone for coming today. So our agenda today, we have a lot of information, but the main purpose is to review the annual report that we are very close to being complete with. It's due to DWR on April 1st. And so we are going to start out by talking about reporting period and timing of this report. And then I'm going to pass it off to Dominic at Woodard and Curran, and he's going to talk about the model update that they did and the draft model results. And then he's going to pass it back to me, and I'll be talking about additional draft results, including sustainable management criteria and hydrographs, the groundwater elevation contour maps, the water quality analysis, an update on subsidence, and the remaining schedule. So reporting period and timing for the second annual report. So it's for water year 2022, which began in October 2021 and extends through September 2022. This reporting period included the first GSP monitoring event, which was conducted in spring 2022. So this was the first monitoring event that was conducted since the GSP was adopted in January of 2022. This annual report includes a model update for the water year 2022. It includes hydrographs for the representative monitoring wells through the spring 2022 monitoring event. It includes groundwater elevation contour maps that were developed for 2 time periods, fall 2021 and spring 2022, which is the seasonal low followed by the seasonal high groundwater elevations. It includes model water budgets and change in groundwater in storage, the water use tables for water year 2022, a water quality analysis, and a subsidence update. So I am going to stop my share and let Dominic share his screen so that he can talk about his model update.
Thanks, Liz. If everyone just give me one moment so I can get this up on the screen for you, and we'll get started. Excellent. So thank you everyone for attending today. We're very excited to show you, present to you some of the information that we've been gathering over the past few months to represent your basin conditions over the past water year, and how we are going to be kind of ultimately both what the model shows us and then how we're going to report some of that information to the Department of Water Resources in your annual update. So if I can, before we get into some of the details, first of all, I want to give you kind of a really quick summary of what the model update is and really kind of what the goals of this effort entails. And so overall, as Liz alluded to, is the goal for this is to supplement the annual report information by utilizing the kind of the best available data that we have to develop a couple major components as far as the flow dynamics in the basin. So this is predominantly going to be to develop basin-wide water budgets, to look at the kind of get temporal and spatial estimates to our groundwater production, effectively kind of trying to understand where we think that where and how much groundwater pumping we have, as far as when we look at some of the private production throughout the basin, as well as looking at kind of the end result of kind of the conditions of our basin, both at the beginning and the end of the 2022 water year. So we're going to kind of look at some of the change in storage, both by principal aquifer and then as looking at the basin as a whole. In order to do that, we're kind of really scoped with what I consider three main tasks. The first of which is just effectively to take the Turlock groundwater model that we've developed during the GSP process, and we're going to kind of extend the time series and a lot of the input data that we have to extend the model period by that 1 year and be able to understand really what are some of the conditions and how do things change over the past year. And then in addition to that, we're also kind of going through kind of a verification, really like a validation process to really make sure that the model is showing us what we anticipate to see, right? So we're going to go through and we're going to discuss a comparison of both the simulated results of the model and then how those compare to some of the observed water stream flow that we're seeing in the real world, to make sure that to kind of gauge our confidence in the model and understand really how that we're representing the basin's conditions to the best of our ability. And then lastly, kind of the little asterisks I want to make to kind of what we are doing as part of this project is that in general, we are updating that time series. We're kind of providing additional information to extend the model, but while we are going to do the verification step, we're not going to change any of the model parameters. We're not changing any of the kind of the core structure of the model. And so that way we kind of are building on to what we've done in the past. So if we kind of now we dive into sort of, well, what do we do for this, for the annual update? And for first major component is we've collected both state, federal, and local resources, and we've taken to collecting the various informations to be able to capture our hydrology, our operations, and kind of how we've interacted with the basin and the kind of the natural system around us. And so in order to do that, I have a kind of a quick summary here of different data sets that we used. And so from our state and federal sources, we are looking at information such as a spatial grid of precipitation, ET, we're looking at land use information, stream flow, and then eventually we'll do that comparison to groundwater level data. But if we want to take a kind of deeper dive into each of those categories, the first one I want to show that really the driver of most of our hydrology in the system is simply going to be precipitation. And so what I have here kind of on the left-hand side is a kind of a heat map of where we've seen the majority of our precipitation in the basin over the 2022 water year. So overall, you can kind of see that as we generally expect, as you kind of get further to the east and further a little bit to the north, you're going to see a little bit higher degrees of precipitation than you are in other locations of the basin. And so we do have this kind of this gradient of precipitation fluctuating between approximately 10 and 12 inches of water over the past year. And overall, we want to make sure we capture that, right? When we do this, the groundwater modeling, that for each of the cells that you see here, these are effectively called model elements, that each of these model elements have unique precipitation, ET, and effectively we're able to kind of capture the distinction between the kind of the spatial elements across and the operations across the basin. If we want to look at kind of the temporal comparison of precipitation, predominantly I want to draw your attention to effectively this last line of the bar chart. This is the 2022 water year. For your reference, and just so we can kind of have a good understanding of the conditions over the full historical period, that I've kind of included what we have is the kind of the full model historical period that occurs from 1991. It was our first year that we started looking at and utilizing the model to track our operations as part of the GSP development. Through 2015 was when the historical model previously ended, as we kind of started to going through the GSP process. Over the past few years here, from 2016 through 2021, we've covered that in last year's annual update. And then finally here in 2022 is really kind of our conditions this year. And so really kind of then focusing on 2022 here, we can see that within the basin, right? So this is all within kind of effectively on the valley floor, that in general, we see a little over 9.5 inches of precipitation in 2022. You can see that in general, that is fairly significantly below our kind of our long-term average here, which is approximately 11 to 12 inches. And so because of that, and we'll kind of get into some of the more details later, but because of that, this year is considered this past year has been considered a critically dry year by the Department of Water Resources. And so we're going to kind of go through some of the impacts to some of that lack of available water over the course of both this presentation and when I eventually pass it back to Liz to go through her content as well. So on the flip side of precipitation, we really, the next kind of major draws are going to be temperature and then ultimately evapotranspiration. So within the Turlock Basin, our major consumptive use is going to be a combination of evapotranspiration effectively. And the majority of that is going to be from our agricultural operations. It's really what drives a lot of our crop demand, a lot of our operations. It really kind of boiled down to temperature and what we have here, which is ET. So in general, we can see that these trends over the kind of the past 30 years or so, we can generally see that ET and temperature both have kind of gradually been increasing over time. And so we want to make sure that the model has the capability to track that. And so what we do is we there are these 3 semi-stations located kind of within two of them within the Turlock Subbasin and one in the Modesto Subbasin. And we take measurements from each of these stations here, which are effectively real world measurements. And that way we can combine this with certain crop coefficients and factors to estimate the overall consumptive use of water within the basin. And this is simply a kind of an annualized bar chart of that. So in addition to evapotranspiration on a unit basis, we also feel like it's important to capture a lot of our land use and cropping patterns across the basin and as a whole. Really, this is kind of the other major carrier as far as what are our our overall water demand looks like. And so over time, you can see that from the 1990 to 2015, we've seen very consistent growth. Now, the one caveat I want to add to this chart is that you'll notice between 2016 and 2022, we're holding land use constant. And that's because while working with both GSAs, by evaluating a couple different data sources, predominantly what is available by the state of California and by the federal government through the USDA, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to our overall land use in the basin. And so as part of this effort, due to that uncertainty, what we're actually doing is we're freezing land use constant from 2015 through 2022. And while that isn't kind of an imperfect solution, we definitely want to acknowledge that both GSAs have discussed and are going through additional land surveying that we're hoping to implement within the next year or two, really kind of to give us a better look, kind of really go through the effort, survey, ground truth, our understanding of the land use, the cropping patterns within the basin. And so for this year, I want to make sure that we all acknowledge that we are holding some of that land use constant based on previous data sets, but we're hoping to refine this in the future. And that, that will, it's kind of considered one of those data gaps we regularly discuss, and that we're hoping to really kind of close that gap and to be able to, moving forward, we'll be able to represent the basin and capture any of those changing land use over time. So, but if we, on the other hand, if we want to break that down, it's looking at the kind of the West and East Turlock GSAs, I really just want to make sure that I have take the opportunity to really show kind of that distribution. Sorry, was there a question? Okay, sorry.
Keep going, Dominic, you're doing good.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I just want to make sure I don't cut anybody off or talk over them. I know it's a little hard communication from a big room, so please flag me down if there are any questions. So if we're looking at the basin split across the kind of the two GSAs here, same general trends that we see comparatively to the long-term historical land use. Both GSAs are seeing increases in an overall agricultural use. And same with our overall urban. You can see here urban in this upper category, particularly in the West, we see urban expansion. But in both basins, we see both GSAs within the basin, we see agricultural expansion as well. Agriculturally, predominantly most of the growth is in the East Turlock Subbasin GSA. But in both basins, we see overall agricultural expansion. And as well as that, we also see our shifts from some of our annual crops to more of our general perennials. Things like our orchards are, have been growing. Our acreage has been growing over kind of the past 30 years. And so we have captured that in the model, and we want to make sure I have the opportunity to showcase that. So then now that we have a really kind of an understanding of where is our water demand coming from, which again is going to be driven by evapotranspiration and our land use, the next question is really take a look at some of our supplies. So within the Turlock Basin, we really kind of have we have a couple main categories. Predominantly, we have our two agricultural urban, or first, when it comes to surface water, we have our two agricultural water purveyors in the form of Turlock and Merced irrigation districts, providing areas to this green area and then a little bit of this kind of bluer area here, respectively. In addition to that, we also have a couple other sources. We have riparian water users, which are kind of represented in these kind of darker purplish colors here. Since that data, surface water isn't measured quite to the same degree as some of our water purveyors provide, we're really estimating that information, and what we're using is the State Water Resources Control Board has a database website called eRIMS that effectively tracks water rights and the ability of those riparian users to divert water from the river systems. And so we're utilizing that data source as well. And then really the last data source we have is the city of Modesto, as they are a provider of some recycled water throughout the subbasin. Predominantly here, you're going to see kind of in some of this area here in this kind of turquoise-ish color. And then there's some recycled water there as well. The last two dots you'll see here, kind of in this green and this purple color here as well, are also recycled water from the city of Turlock and Hillmar Cheese Company, respectively. So we just make sure that we capture really all the different surface and recycled water users within the basin and get those into the model as far as where they deliver on a spatial level. But if we want to look at kind of the overall quantity of surface water that was available this past year, again, if I can draw your attention to the 2022 water year, particularly one of the things as I kind of alluded to when we talked about precipitation, while a lot are predominantly our water purveyors, the water availability is based on effectively our upper watersheds and what's available throughout our reservoir system in the Sierra Nevadas. Overall, this water year was still a very dry year. It was designated as a critically dry year by the Department of Water Resources. And effectively, because of that, due to water availability, we see comparatively to long-term trends, we see fairly significant reductions in our surface water availability. And so what we have effectively here, we broke down our surface water supplies into a lot of different aspects as far as how their operations are being handled. But the biggest bar you'll see here is obviously deliveries, right? This is what is available to our growers within the basin. But we also want to make sure we do things like capture seepage, both from our canal system, from the reservoir that's within the basin. So we do capture seepage and evaporation from the canals, the reservoirs, and from both TID and Merced ID's operations, and that those are represented here as being a contributor of surface water entering the aquifer system.
How are you supposed to be able to identify those? Because I only see the same colors on the descriptions, but you have it colored in the bar graph, but I don't see colored bars saying Turlock Lake seepage, conveyance seepage. How do I know which is which out of the large brown on the bottom above the bluish, or how do you know what's what?
Sure, absolutely. So if you look here on the kind of the bottom half of this legend, I know on the right-hand side, they're all
okay.
Kind of
Now
okay.
Is there any way you can make this image, when you were on the screen, you were full screen on the computer, but this image is only about 2/3 of the screen. Is it any way to make the screen a little bit larger, or this image a little larger on the screen?
I may have to defer if there's any Zoom experts around, but I think if you right click on either my picture or or my presentation, you should be able to right click one of them and ask them to highlight or highlight or pin or something like that for yourself.
Okay, thank you.
And if that doesn't do it for you, our full presentation is available on the website, so that if it helps, if you want to follow along and zoom in, that may help you kind of see some of the more fine details of the presentation. So, but let me know if you have any other questions like that come up. Okay. So then moving along, then if we have, so the next major source of water within the subbasin, predominantly what brings us today as when looking at groundwater sustainability, is our overall groundwater production within the basin. So groundwater production within the basin is kind of split into two different categories. First, we have what we're considering agency-based groundwater production. And the reason why we kind of split them into two is because most of the agencies within the basin provide and have data and provide that data to us as far as what is their overall groundwater production available at each well. And so what you can see here on the left-hand side is effectively a map of every single agency-based well within the basin. And so the model takes basically that well level layer of that level of resolution, monthly pumping on for each and every well within the basin, and agency well within the basin, and we map it to the model grid and quantify that volume of water. In addition to that, we also have some pumping estimates of private pumping, because those are not metered wells and not reported pumping numbers. We estimate that using a lot of the demand estimates and water supply estimates that we have based on the previous slides. And I'll get to those in a minute. But when it comes to our overall agency-based pumping, what I've done here is I've kind of broken it up into two main categories. We have our agricultural agency pumping on the left-hand side, and we have our urban agency pumping on the right-hand side. And so predominantly our major agricultural agency within the basin is going to be the Turlock Irrigation District. And so what we can kind of see here on this chart, if we look at our long-term trends, is that we can see that in general, TID has been reducing their overall agency pumping over the kind of that past 30-year period, but principally, we also have, we supplement our surface water supply with additional groundwater in very dry and critical water years. So what you can see here is that definitely both in 2021 and 2022, those were critically dry years. And because of that, TID has pumped what is higher than normal volumes associated compared to their long-term trends. And we have pumped additional groundwater to supplement our surface water supply. And again, this is only our agency pumping. We'll get to some of the private pumping in a moment. And then if we look to the other water use sector and we look at our urban agency pumping, simply because a lot of our urban use isn't as heavily driven by both our surface water supply being within the Turlock Basin, almost at least as of right now, all of our urban supply and private groundwater production, private urban groundwater production is met through groundwater. And so because of that, we can see is that the entire curve here, as far as urban pumping, is based on demand. And so what we can see here in the historical period, as we kind of go in the mid 2000s, we had a peak. There were a lot of conservation efforts that have occurred since then, and then that is kind of offset by growth in population and growth for that perspective, right? So we have this constant battle when it comes to our urban and municipal water supply, as far as urban population growth and overall water demand from that perspective being offset by conservation efforts. And so because of that, we have kind of a peak here in the mid 2000s, but since then we have seen a general decline of groundwater pumping from our urban agencies over the past 30 or so years. So for the most part, that includes most of the data that went into the model. And so now we get to, in my opinion, the fun part. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to go through the model results. I have water budgets, hydrographs, and eventually we look at some of our change in storage maps as kind of what we consider our big picture. So once we compile all that information, if we want to take a look at what is our water use budgets. And so this is really how are we utilizing water. And so overall, as I said, at kind of the first couple of slides where we looked at land use, evapotranspiration, precipitation, that really drives what is our overall agricultural and urban demand. And so on the lower half of these two charts, you'll see agricultural demand here on the left and urban demand here on the right. And so because of that, as we would often, effectively as we would expect, we see a lot of fluctuation, and this is going to be predominantly driven by that combination of ET and precipitation. Given that the past 2 years have been fairly dry years, but we can see that long-term trend of increasing ET, increasing temperatures, even though we've had fairly constant land use, or at least we're modeling fairly constant land use over the past 5 years or so. We do see when it comes to kind of the short-term period from 2015 through 2022, we see a general growth in our overall agricultural demand. On the flip side of that, when we want to look at our water supply within the basin, this is really, again, goes back to surface water availability, the water year indexing being a dry year. And over the past few years, particularly in this 2022 year that we're talking about now, we can see that in general, we have a smaller degree of surface water deliveries, which is represented here in this blue color. And that surface water delivery is being offset by additional groundwater production, represented here in this gray color. And as far as when we get into the urban water supply on the other side of this equation, as I said a second ago, all of our urban demand is met through groundwater production. And so simply there's a direct relationship between urban demand and how we're meeting that demand, which is groundwater production. So then I'm going to take a step further and look at the subbasin's water budgets broken down into the east and the west Turlock Subbasin GSAs. And so as we want to look at these, we'll see that the vast majority of the West Turlock Subbasin GSA since TID provides a lot of additional surface water to meet their growers' demand. In general, you'll see that TID and the West Turlock Subbasin GSA, a much greater percentage of their water supply overall water supply is going to be surface water deliveries. But again, as I alluded to, again, with their operations in the 2021-2022 water year, again, less surface water availability means more groundwater production. And again, that's something very similar we see in the last drought, where we see in 2013 through 2015, those sequential critical water years often equal more groundwater production throughout that period. And then when it comes to the same thing, when it comes to the urban, the vast majority of the urban water demand within the Turlock Subbasin is within West Turlock Subbasin GSA. So you'll see the bulk of the water demand from the urban side of the equation being represented within this GSA. On the other hand, when it comes to the East Turlock Subbasin GSA, in general, there's a little bit less overall agriculture, but that agricultural is met almost entirely with groundwater supply, which is why you see here in kind of this grayish color. But certainly we don't want to not count for Merced Irrigation District's deliveries through the Northside Canal. And so we do see some of the kind of this blue color here being their groundwater, or sorry, their surface water supply being represented as well. So in general, as now that we kind of have an idea of how much water and where that groundwater is being being pumped in the basin, is I want to bring kind of circle that back around and look at kind of this spatial breakdown of our groundwater pumping. Effectively, this is a heat map. This is an item that is a regulatory requirement for us to present to DWR for the annual report. And so now that I've really just talked about how we got into this, this is our first of the major components that we're reporting in our annual report, is this figure here. Overall in the basin and over the 2022 water year, we're estimating about 550,000 acre feet of groundwater production, with a little over 500,000 being attributed to our agricultural groundwater production, with 75,000 of that being from our agricultural agencies, again predominantly TID, and but our private agricultural production being about 440,000 acre feet. The flip side of that, again, is going to be the urban groundwater production. We see in here about 40,000 acre feet of urban production, and this is going to be a combination of the agency pumping and urban private. So this is any rural domestic water users that have private wells that we want to make sure that we estimate and we account for them as well. So in general, if you look at this kind of heat map, what we have is fairly close to what we expect. On the western side of the basin, where we know there again most of our agricultural demand is being met with surface water in general, we see lower groundwater overall groundwater pumping, and on the other hand, when we look on the eastern side of the basin, most of our agricultural production is met with groundwater pumping. The demand is met with pumping, and so the overall supply is, we see a little bit higher groundwater production per unit area on the eastern part of the basin.
Hey, Dominic,
Yes.
what does the 1.6 mean? 1.6 feet?
Yeah, sorry. So 1.6 feet is kind of a unit basis, and so effectively, if we look at the basin as a whole, we divide this 554,000 acre feet by the total acreage of the basin. That in general we have a depth of 1.6 feet of water multiplied by that overall area is what our groundwater pumping is.
Thank you.
Okay, so now that we have a kind of a direct idea of what our operations throughout the basin mean and really what our water use is, the next step is to discuss how that water use affects the aquifer system. And so the first step of that, in my opinion, is to look at what we call kind of the operational water budget. Now, this is, in general, this is going to look at the kind of the major components that we have the direct kind of what I consider the vertical breakdown of our water use. And so what you can see here, this is looking from the aquifer's perspective. And so the first major component we have here is our groundwater pumping in this kind of the gray color here. And so effectively from the groundwater perspective, that water is leaving the aquifer. And so in general, this is that 550,000 acre feet of water that particularly occurred in the 2022 water year. And that is most heavily represented to kind of our anthropogenic use of the groundwater system. Now, the inverse of groundwater pumping is really what goes back into the aquifer system from our operations. And from our operations, we really kind of get two main categories. First is our canal and reservoir recharge, represented here in this blue color. This is predominantly related to our surface water supply and the movement and the conveyance of water to our growers throughout the basin. And so that's going to be represented here in this purple. And then the other factor here is deep percolation. Now, deep percolation is actually both anthropogenic and correlates to precipitation. But in general, the vast majority of our deep percolation within the basin is going to be due to applied water, right? So effectively, we pump groundwater out of the basin, apply that water to our agricultural and urban parcels, and then a percentage of that goes to evapotranspiration to feed our crops. The other percentage of that is percolated back into the groundwater system. And so that's represented here in this kind of the green color. What I have here on the right-hand side is effectively the balance of all that, and really helps us, and this is really what helps us understand how our basin interacts with the aquifer system at a very kind of a coarse, pure level, to understand how our operations, whether we are generally are net extracting water out of the basin, or whether we are contributing water to the basin. And so in general, comparatively to these three factors, we see that our net recharge of the basin is in fact negative. And so what that means for the 2022 water year is that in general, the basin extracted more water vertically out of the system than we recharged. And you can see here, it's just under about 400,000 acre feet of water over the past, within this past year. The only other kind of major component.
That's east and west combined. That's east and west combined.
Yes, this is east and west. And then if you give me 1 second, actually, I can jump to the GSA breakdown here. And so first, if we want to take a look at the West Turlock Subbasin GSA, in general, we can kind of see a little bit more of a balance over the past couple of years. In general, though, particularly again when it comes to the same distribution between groundwater and surface water supply, because it is a critically dry year. In general, we see higher levels of groundwater production to supplement our surface water supply. And that's why we kind of see this bump here over the past 2 years in our overall groundwater production. That groundwater production, similar to when we looked at the basin overall, is we see that there's some additional recharge, both from our conveyance system and from our operations, our deep percolation. That is deep percolation of groundwater, deep percolation of surface water, and deep percolation of any precipitation. So the balance of looking on the West GSA is that in the 2021-2022, but again focusing on just 2022, again these 2 dry years here, is that in general on these very critical years that the West Turlock Subbasin GSA is a net extractor from the system. Comparatively, this actually stands in contrast to kind of the more normal operations or some of the wetter years that we have, where the West GSA is a net contributor to the system, but they are going to be in flux in some of these more critically dry years. When looking at the East Turlock Subbasin GSA, again, because we are a groundwater dependent area for our agricultural and private domestic water users, we're going to see a much more consistent deep percolation, groundwater production is driving most of our interaction with the aquifer system, with some additional recharge due to percolation of both precipitation and that applied groundwater here. We do have some canal and reservoir recharge. It is much smaller because the only major canal system that effectively is going through the West GSA, there's a fraction of TID canal that may go through there. But in addition to that, we also have the Northside Canal from Merced Irrigation District that is accounted for here. But that in general, the West Turlock Subbasin GSA is a kind of a net extractor from the basin as a whole. So now if we kind of want to combine that with some of the other factors here, what I have here is the overall groundwater budget. And so compared to the past couple of slides, the major things that we looked at when looking at the basin as a whole, we can see the same factors. This is the groundwater production, the deep percolation that I spoke to, the canal and reservoir recharge in here in the purple. And there are a couple other factors, and these are really is how those operations affect the rest of the basin, reflect the other flow dynamics within our subbasin and the some of the subbasins and the hydrologic features around us. Principally, that can be really focused in on kind of 2 main categories you're going to see here. One being our stream aquifer interaction. So if this is effectively whether we can contribute or we extract surface water from the stream system into the aquifer system over time. And so that in general, if you look at we look at overall in the 2022 water year, over this past year, again, because probably heavily because it was a critical water year, that the aquifer system extracted additional water. So our stream system surrounding the basin is contributing additional water to recharging the groundwater system. In addition to that, the other major component we have here is subsurface flow from adjacent areas, and that combined with our inflow from the foothills. And so shows that in general for the 2022 year, we had the subsurface flow between Turlock and its surrounding basins is that our net factor there is that we received about 30,000 acre feet of subsurface inflow from the 3 adjoining basins, Modesto, Delta Mendota, and Merced. So in general, if we want to look at kind of the breakdown as far as kind of the volumes, what I have here represented here on the right is that in general, the overall storage of the basin, which is that last factor that I hadn't spoken to, which is this kind of bright orange color here. In general, for the 2022 water year, our overall groundwater storage has declined by about 275,000 acre feet. And again, you can see here, compared to long-term trends, there are both years in which we are, the groundwater storage goes up, water levels go up in some of the wetter years throughout our historical period. Some of the more standard operation years, you'll see that they're about equal. Sometimes we, some of the smaller periods, you can see here, sometimes we're net gains, and sometimes we're net declines in storage over throughout the historical period. And then predominantly effectively these very critical years like 2021, 2022, in the 2013 through 2015 drought is really where we see their greatest levels of decline, right? Surface water availability is not there. General precipitation within the basin is lower. And so because of that, we see the greatest change in storage in these critically dry years.
Okay, and the 275,000 acre foot, that is over the period, or that's just in last year?
That's just last year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So this is our kind of effectively our overall big picture when it comes to the water budget. The next step over the next couple of slides, what I want to go to is really what I alluded to earlier, is that kind of validation stage, right? So we have an idea of this, of a lot of these dynamic features here, right? They're all interdependent upon one another, particularly when it comes to things like our stream aquifer interaction, our subsurface flow from our adjacent areas, the change in storage. These are all things that it's really important and it's really valuable for us to understand how well does the model track this data, and how does that compare to some of the observed data that we have, right? Because as of right now, water budget is very hard to quantify, except for things maybe like groundwater pumping, where we can actually meter that. A lot of these other things are not meterable, and so we have to use some tools like a groundwater model and some of the features that we can do, and how we can really gain some confidence in that is to see how does the model represent some of the observed data. So what I have here over the next couple of slides, I believe I have like 8 or so of them, is I'm going to kind of bounce around as give everybody here a quick summary of what does the model look like over the course of the historical period. And so what you're going to see here is I have a couple different lines. And so if I can point those out, first and foremost is going to be the observation data, right? These are measured water levels throughout the basin. And this is really what we're going to be comparing our simulated data, which is what is represented here in this kind of light bluish color. The solid light blue color is what the model is estimating, right? It's not going to be perfect, but it's because it is, again, as I go through these, it's a regional model. We don't have the resolution both in the model grid itself, but also in the availability of data. And there's a lot of features here that the model is not going to be perfect everywhere. And so I'll be the first person to admit that. But we do think that when evaluating regional water trends, that we do have a pretty excellent tool here. And so I want to go through each of these with you. Then maybe a kind of a secondary factor is we also included our minimum thresholds, measurable objectives, and then where they apply are interim milestones. This specific well doesn't have an interim milestone, but you'll see as we kind of get into this, some of the others will. And a lot of these will get into a little bit more of the greater detail as far as the management of the basin, because I do actually want to make sure that we preface a lot of this with we're not evaluating our basin. Our basin is not graded based on what a model says. It's based on what the observed data is. And so once I get done talking about what our model says, I think that I'll pass it back to Liz, and she'll be able to have a little bit better conversation with all of you about where our observed data is and how that interacts with our interim milestone, measure objectives, and minimum thresholds. But I did want to include them just for the sake of understanding exactly where we lie. Oops, sorry. So the first one, I actually didn't need to change my slide. So the first one I have here is on the kind of the western, central part of the western half of the subbasin, kind of in a predominantly agricultural area on the western areas. And so what you can see here is that overall, the model tracks the observed data pretty well. There are certainly going to be variations from the observed data, but in general, again, it captures kind of the regional trends. Particularly as we go through these, I want to also draw your attention really to is that we are most heavily focused on kind of long-term trends, and particularly when it comes to the trends, how they react to different water conditions, next to different hydrologic year types, and again, focused the majority of this conversation on kind of the 2021, 2022 water year, the most recent conditions, and how the model is tracking with the new data that we're putting into it. So similarly, kind of moving, and I'm going to continue to move west-east here. And so one of the, as we kind of can move a little bit further to the south, but still stay kind of within the western part of the basin. This is kind of a more recent well, so we don't have data back into the 90s and the early 2000s. But in general, we can kind of see that when it comes to this particular well, as I said, we are tracking the observed data fairly well, although there's certainly room for improvement in some of these. And again, this comes to our balance of regional versus kind of local conditions, but that in general, we are kind of tracking the historical data fairly well. Then again, kind of moving a little bit further to the east, again, back into the north, we could, again, tracking observed data fairly well comparatively to kind of the long-term trends. And as we move a little bit further to the east, I definitely wanted to make sure we kind of include some areas where it's certainly not perfect, and really kind of, but I really want to make sure we point out that while there is certainly some uncertainty when it comes to some of the operations of the basin in some of these kind of the middle years of this period, really want to again try to focus your attention principally on kind of the last couple of years here. And because really a lot of our goal when we do a lot of these reporting is comparing, is looking at the trends and making sure the model captures the trends very well rather than the absolute values, because a lot of times these absolute values can be indicative of often much more localized conditions. And so, for example, if there are two wells right next to each other, simply due to the model, the resolution of the model, we're not able to kind of capture any kind of near well interactions between the two. On the other hand, when we look at kind of long-term overall trends, we can kind of see that we're still tracking and we're capturing a lot of the operations and the impacts to the basin when it comes to some of the critical water years, right? So for example, again, in the last drought, that 2013 to 2015 period, we're capturing some of the declines. Then from that 2016, 2017, particularly 2017, over the next couple of years to about 2020, we see a little bit kind of like this bounce here due to kind of more standard operations, a couple of wet years, less critically dry years. And then again, as we get into the 2021, 2022 water years, we see what we'd expect as far as our overall water levels declining again. And the model does represent that. So then again, continuing our path a little bit further to the east, again, back to the northern half of the eastern part of the basin. Excuse me. You can see that overall in general, we track the long-term trends fairly well. In this case, we're a little bit under throughout the entire simulation period. We're a little bit under the observed data at this specific well. But overall, we're tracking the same overall decline, right? The slope is really a lot of our target when we do calibrate these models. The slope in those interactions there are really what we focus to make sure for the sake of long-term regional planning. And as you can see here, we capture a lot of that. Moving a little bit further to the south, but still staying in the eastern part of the basin. Similar, we have a same general trend. In this specific instance, we don't quite capture some of the fluctuations, the seasonal fluctuations that we see here. You can see kind of in the later here, there's some of this probably a 30-foot fluctuation between spring and fall monitoring events. We don't quite see that level of spiking, but again, when it comes to like long-term regional planning, we are tracking the long-term and inter-year relationships fairly well within the model, and we're capturing particularly some of the impacts of our operations on the aquifer system. Then when it comes a little bit further down here to the south, kind of along the Merced River, I know this has been a topic of conversation over the past few years as we've gone through the GSP, and so I want to make sure I include a couple of our more recent monitoring wells that are specifically targeted towards evaluating groundwater conditions in the model, as well as observed data of the groundwater levels and the stream aquifer interaction. And so I think I have 2 or 3 along the Merced River. But again, particularly for this one, this well wasn't even evaluated for the model. through the 2015, which is what his original historical period. So it's actually kind of nice to see when we did put in this observed data, that we are still tracking some of that data well. There is some of this, some uncertainty with what is, with kind of this bulk, this bunch of, this bunch of data in 2020. But I do think that this is a kind of a misalignment of data. And so we're not particularly kind of worried about it here, but I want to make sure we included it in the chart nonetheless. Similarly, again, moving a little bit further to the east, we have East Turlock Subbasin GSA well 14. Same kind of a similar story as I did in the previous slide, that we're tracking it. It's a newer well. We only have data over the past few years, but the model is kind of tracking impacts of our operations, and a slight decline in water levels there as well. And then finally, I think the last well I have for today, when we're looking here at well 20, is on the kind of, this is one of the most furthest east wells that we have. We can see that our operations in general are, again, continuing to decline. In this instance here, we're actually overestimating wells, or some of the observed data in the far east. And this is one where is that, you know, the further east we go, traditionally there's a lot less data availability. And so this well, as well as many of the others that are being recently installed on the eastern section, far eastern sections of the basin, we're definitely very thankful and looking forward to kind of tweaking the model a little bit here and there to really make sure we can capture operations where historically we haven't had a lot of data and we haven't had a lot of information to calibrate with. So, but I want to make sure that you still have the opportunity to see and understand some of the interactions that the model is tracking similar slopes of declines in groundwater level over the past few years. So with that being said, I think overall we're still fairly confident with our model and what it's able to represent, our overall understanding, our impacts to the change in water levels, and then subsequent, you know, the storage, the interaction between water levels and groundwater storage are fairly in tune with one another. And so with kind of that validation step kind of out of the way, really we want to then present whatever our change in storage. And these are some of kind of the final figures and numbers that we need to present to DWR. So the first of which is going to be looking at our change in storage for the subbasin as a whole. So this is looking at overall, this is regardless of the principal aquifers. So if you remember, we have 3 principal aquifers, and this is kind of the culmination of all 3 of those. Now, the next couple of slides, I'll break that down a little bit further. But the major component here that we said is that of that overall change in storage, that we mentioned earlier when we looked at our groundwater budget, is that there's about 274,000 acre feet reduction in groundwater storage in the 2022 water year. And this should give you an idea of roughly the spatial breakdown of that. Now, principally, there's a lot of other factors involved here. And so, but that is not just related to our general operations. There's subsurface flow, but both within and out, and there's intra subsurface flow within the basin itself. Between each of these elements, water is moving between each of kind of these spatial units that we have here. And then there's that unit, there's flow between the west and the east Turlock Subbasin GSAs, as well as some interbasin flows between the Turlock Subbasin and the various other 3 subbasins that kind of effectively surround us. Overall, though, we can see that the kind of the greatest decline in groundwater storage is occurring here in some of the western parts of the subbasin. And again, principally, this is going to be caused due to kind of the differing in operations of it being a critically dry year over the past year, right? Because we have a kind of a standard of operations when it comes to our water levels due to the amount of surface water supply that is available in the western part of the basin. And being a critical year, we expect certain declines from that kind of that standard of operation due to the additional groundwater production that has to occur to meet our overall water supply. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, but I've been attending the TID Customer Academy, and that's not what they're reporting. The reason they're reporting on the west side of the district, or the west side of the subbasin, is because if they don't, the basement houses are filling up with water. There's too much water on the west side. It's not the west side that has an issue. It's obviously the east side. I totally don't understand that, because you can ask Michael there. You know, you can talk to Michael about it. It's the west side that's okay. They have more water than they need. The recharge needs to be done on the east side.
Sure. So I think, and Michael Freeze, please feel free to interrupt me if I misspeak to any of this. But there is my understanding is that there is a combination, right? That we do have water level control wells occurring throughout in part of the west part of the basin. But in general, over the past year, it looks like because in this specific year of it being a critically dry year, our surface water supply is being supplemented by some additional groundwater production in the west. In addition to that, there, as I mentioned a second ago, there is a lot of subsurface flow occurring within the basin. And so some of the areas here, I mean, we already looked at the groundwater production heat map a couple slides ago. And we do know that there is predominantly a lot of groundwater production in part of the east sections of the basin where there's not surface water supply to be able to supplement their agriculture. But that there is subsurface flow moving from west to east, as well as in other directions. We have some flow moving to Delta Mendota, as well as in Modesto and Merced as well. And so there's a full dynamics there that isn't super, I guess, clearly apparent within this figure here, but in general, and backed up by some of the hydrographs that I showed a couple slides ago, and I can bring those up again if that's helpful. But we do see overall declines in water level and storage throughout the western part of the basin. I don't know if anybody has anything, Michael or anybody would like to add to that.
So maybe the other Michael will chime in first. This is Michael Tietze, the general manager for ETS GSA. And what we take away from this annual report, and you'll see it also in the data that's going to be presented by Todd, is that ETS GSA has a lot of wells that are below their minimum threshold. We do have a cone of depression. We have various different activities in progress to get on the right side of this extraction imbalance that we have within ETS GSA. So I think it's important to keep perspective and focus in order to be successful in implementing the GSP. And we do have various different activities in progress in terms of developing projects and decreasing our groundwater demand in ETS GSA. So, I just want to put out there that we're very aware and very focused that we have a heavy lift to take groundwater levels which are below minimum thresholds in wells in ETS GSA to bring those groundwater levels up. And we don't take this information at all as an indication that we don't have a problem. The other factor is that it's important that we coordinate between GSAs in terms of monitoring to fill data gaps and understand the interchange between the eastern principal aquifers and the western principal aquifers. And as Dominic points out, there's a number of different factors that contribute to storage reduction in the eastern and western principal aquifers. And we are going to be focusing monitoring wells and other efforts to better understand that interchange and the relationship between the east and the west so that we can make good data-driven solutions in terms of how we manage the basin. So, Michael, I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
There's no thunder from me. Just to reiterate, this is an annual report. It's like a second or third critical year in a row. In a typical or average time, you'll see the area west along the San Joaquin River have high groundwater levels leading to drainage pumping. So much water we need drainage pumping. In a year like we've just had with limited surface water availability, it's resulted in more groundwater pumping within Turlock Irrigation District area. So that's had a demand on the stored water. And then you're also seeing potentially influences from areas outside the Turlock Subbasin who are pumping harder and maybe pulling water out of the Turlock Subbasin that's in storage. So as Mike mentioned, this is an annual report. And it shows what happens during a critically dry year or after a series of critically dry years. And so it's good information to have. And as we work forward with projects and programs, like Mike mentioned, we're making sure this is not what we have every single year is the key, not just relying on hydrology, but also our program managements and actions to make sure we're not constantly withdrawing from storage.
Michael, you still have a quorum?
Yes, I do right now. You go to a dentist appointment?
Need to go, sorry.
Mike,
Fine.
nobody else can leave. You go.
I have one additional question for Dominic. Dominic, when you were explaining the freezing the land use for 5 years or so, whose idea was that? Because these figures are available. What was the purpose of freezing the land use when these are annual figures that are available and can be, established?
Sure. So it was actually a joint decision between both GSAs. Effectively, there was a lot of uncertainty associated with the land use data that was available. We looked at the information across approximately 3 different data sources, and all of them, there was a combination of they didn't necessarily agree with one another. A lot of them didn't match the trends that we know to be occurring throughout the basin. For example, I think one of them showed a very significant decline in permanent crops in this past year, a very high percentage of decline in permanent crops, which we, as a group understand and know that didn't necessarily occur. And I think it is, and principally, it was effectively the uncertainty associated with and lack of confidence in any of those particular data sets. And so that what we effectively discussed it across both the consultant team and with some of the GSAs. And we felt that this was the best course of action until a kind of more localized survey and evaluation of land use can occur. And I believe that is ongoing and hopefully I believe should be available within the next year or so.
Thank you.
And so, and then also kind of getting back to a little bit of your previous comment related to this figure, as opposed to looking at the kind of the overall kind of health of the water levels within the basin. I do want to just kind of add the clarification that when right now we're looking at change in storage in the basin, and so this is the 1 year impact of our operations within the basin, and this is change in storage. This isn't necessarily the actual groundwater levels, which is what some of the things that Liz will go through with you guys in a couple of minutes here, right? And so a little bit of your comments of relating to high water levels and using some pumping for drainage purposes, right? Like some of the water levels, particularly here, even in this darkest area, we're seeing changes in groundwater storage of 3 feet at absolute maximum. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's not even, I'm pretty sure this is actually sub 2 feet of change in storage. And so water levels can still be fairly high in some of these areas that show the greatest change in storage. And I won't steal Liz's thunder when looking at comparing those, but I just want to make sure that we kind of keep that in perspective, that overall, we're looking at a change in storage of a maximum in some of these areas of 2 feet change, and that the overall that water level can still be fairly high in some of these areas. So I don't know. I just want to make sure that doesn't cause any confusion if that were the case. Okay, so I think while this had tells the bulk of the story, I do want to just take a quick second and distribute it across each of the different principal aquifers. Principally, when looking at the western, upper, and lower principal aquifers, in general, we can see that for the upper principal aquifer, which is again the kind of our shallow aquifer system that is above the Corcoran clay, we see the majority of our change in storage, our decline in overall storage, kind of being in the southern half here of the basin, kind of approximately near kind of the Hilmar area, but in general, kind of a fairly consistent decline throughout the majority of the rest of the western principal aquifer, although we do have some actually have a slight increase in some of this along the San Joaquin River, particularly kind of in this Patterson adjacent part of the basin, comparative Delta Mendota. And this is going to be, because a lot of our flows in the upper principal aquifer are very interactive with the stream aquifer interaction with each of the major 3 rivers, as well as our interaction with the neighbors, right? And so, for example, this is a kind of a high point. This is near a high point in the Delta Mendota Basin. And in general, the Turlock Subbasin does have a kind of a net outflow to Delta Mendota. And so, but in this area here, we actually have a very little outflow, right? So this is, we're keeping a little bit more of our water. And so because of that, we actually have our change in storage 0, or actually just a tiny bit above 0 in each of these couple elements here. This differs to the comparatively to the lower western principal aquifer, where we kind of see actually the inverse of some of that effect. And so where we see along the San Joaquin River as being our areas of greatest storage decline, and then these are kind of in the deeper aquifer system where we're seeing a little bit more subsurface flow kind of between Delta Mendota and the Turlock Subbasin. And then when it comes to eastern principal aquifer, there's no vertical gradient here. So this is actually the exact same as the first map that I showed a couple slides ago. But again, we just kind of want to make sure we break it up into the principal aquifers so that we each understand how much water is being lost to our overstorage overall. But in general here, you can see that we see the greatest declines in our storage being on kind of the northern half of the eastern principal aquifer. In fact, we are even have a slight influx of water kind of filling some of this gap from the Modesto subbasin, but in general, we have a kind of a north to south, northwest to southeast kind of gradient here, where we're seeing a little bit water of kind of flowing to some of these to effectively our cone of depression that we have in kind of the eastern part of the subbasin. So thank you for all your attention. I know this is a ton of information. So I'm about to pass it to Liz, but before I go, does anyone have any questions or anything they would like to discuss related to the modeling effort for this last year's annual report? Excellent. Well, then thank you for your time, and I'll pass it back to you, Liz.
Okay, thank you so much, Dominic. I'm going to share my screen again and continue on. Bear with me. Okay. So I trust you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you. I feel compelled to ask that every time. Okay, so as Dominic alluded to several times, the focus of the next few slides is on the spring 2022 monitoring event. The focus really is on measured data now. What did we actually see in the wells? What was actually measured? And what's important to keep in mind here is that the spring 2022 monitoring event, which happened during the reporting period for this annual report, was the very first GSP monitoring event that we had, because the GSP was submitted in January 2022. So for this monitoring event, most of the water levels were measured in March. Water levels were measured in 46 different representative monitoring wells, which you'll see the acronym RMW for throughout the rest of the presentation. There were no measurements in 2 of these 2 wells. One of them is a USGS well, and the GSAs, in particular, the West Turlock Sub GSA is working with USGS on gaining access to this well. And there's a well within ETS GSA, ETS GSA 12. The well casing has collapsed, and ETS GSA is working to find a replacement well. I believe they have found a replacement well and are in the process of permitting it so that it can be added to the network, and then 12 will be removed. And so following the spring event, the data were uploaded to the DWR Sigma portal in accordance with regulations and what we're supposed to do. And we updated the hydrographs for the representative monitoring wells with the water levels that were measured. And this picture on the right-hand side of the screen is of one of our new monitoring wells, MW68B, that was constructed with Prop 68 funding about a year ago. So minimum thresholds. I'll be going through and sort of summarizing how our spring 2022 water levels compared to our sustainable management criteria. And starting with minimum thresholds. Again, we have two monitoring networks. There's a monitoring network for chronic lowering of water levels, which is also proxy for subsidence and storage. And the second is interconnected surface water. So for the chronic lowering of water levels, out of a total of about 35 wells measured, we were above the MT in 16 of those wells, below the MT in 19. As I said earlier, water levels were not measured in 2 wells. And then we have 7 wells in the network that do not have MTs yet. And the reason they don't is because they were constructed very recently. They're Prop 68 wells, like the picture I showed you on the previous slide was one of those wells. And we just don't have enough data yet to set a reasonable MT. And so as we collect more water level data, we will set an MT. And then for the interconnected surface water monitoring network, there were 5 wells that were above the MT and 6 that were below. Interim milestones. So when we developed the GSP, we anticipated that there would be MT exceedances. We all knew that this was going to happen. So this is not a surprise. We saw water levels that were declining in most of the representative monitoring wells. Drought conditions have persisted through water year 2022, as Dominic said, another critically dry year. And so, projects and management actions will take time to implement and to have an effect on water levels and support the recovery of those water levels to the minimum thresholds. So the wells that have the most significant declining trends were expected to continue to decline below the minimum thresholds. And so interim milestones were developed for those wells. And so the interim milestone is a water level that is set below the minimum threshold for year 2027. And it allows sort of a glide path for water levels to dip below the minimum threshold. And with the recognition that after 2027, the hope is then that they will start recovering so that by 2032, they will be at about the minimum threshold. In 2037, they will be halfway between the minimum threshold and the measurable objective. And then by 2042, by the time we hit sustainability, they will be at the measurable objective.
Liz, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
We're talking about, in the future, this is the year that the aquifer on the east side needs to be recharged. And they should be pouring water on their land to recharge the aquifer. And that's just what I'm thinking. Why aren't we? Okay, well, I'll stop. Thank you. Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I think ETS-GSA is working really hard to develop projects and to look at ways to do this. So I think the entire subbasin wants to do exactly what you're saying. This is an extremely wet year. And they're working hard to figure out projects so that this recharge can be done. So, so what's the interim milestone kind of exceedance summary? So for the monitoring network for chronic lowering of water levels, we've got 19 wells with IMs. Almost all of them were above the IMs in spring 2022. There's one well, TID 10, that's in the western upper principal aquifer that was dry in the spring of 2022. The bottom few feet of that well seem to be potentially silted up, and the GSA is working to figure that out. But it appears the water level on that well is definitely below the MT and either right at or slightly below the IM, and we don't know for sure. But that is the only well in question with the IM. The rest of the wells for chronic lowering of water levels are above the IMs. And for interconnected surface water, we have 7 wells that have IMs, and they all were above the IM. So what is the definition of undesirable results? This was defined in the GSP developed by the GSAs. And for chronic lowering of water levels, an undesirable result for each principal aquifer will occur when at least 1/3 of representative monitoring wells exceed the MT for that principal aquifer in 3 consecutive fall monitoring events. For interconnected surface water, it occurs when on one of the 3 monitored rivers when half of the representative monitoring wells for that river exceed the MT in 2 consecutive fall monitoring events. So let's keep this in mind. The spring event that happened this year in water year 2022 does not count towards this meeting these criteria because it was spring. So I'm going to show you a series of maps here that compare the water levels to the minimum thresholds. And then after each one, show you a few hydrographs. So this is the map for the Western Upper Principal Aquifer. The green dots are wells with water levels in the spring that were above the minimum threshold. The red dots are below. And then we shaded the wells that do not have MTs yet. Again, the Prop 68 monitoring wells, the relatively new wells with not a lot of data are blue. And then the wells that were not measured are gray. And so in spring 2022, 44% of the wells in the Western Upper Principal Aquifer were below the MT. There were 9 wells that were above, 7 were below. You can see sort of the distribution of these red dots, the wells with wet water levels below the MT, kind of 2 down here. There's a grouping here, just kind of north and northwest of Turlock around Keys. And then there's 1 here near Delhi. And so here are some hydrographs for the Western Upper Principal Aquifer. This is for TID 106. I have circled in red the measurement that was taken in the spring event. And in the spring at this well, we were above the MT. And the general trends, you can see since the drought of the major drought of 2013 to 16, water levels recovered. But since that recovery, they have been declining. And we've seen a further decline in the last water year because of the ongoing drought. This is TID 191. This water level in the spring was slightly below the MT. And we're seeing, again, the similar pattern in water levels throughout the Western Upper Principal Aquifer, where we've had a post-drought recovery, and then we've had decline since then because of the critically dry years. This is the map for the Western Lower Principal Aquifer. There are only 4 wells with minimum thresholds that were measured in the spring. One of them, the Smyrna Park well in series, was above the minimum threshold. Then we've got a group of 3 monitoring wells, 2 within Turlock and 1 technically in Denair, that were below the minimum threshold. 1 well was not measured, and that's this USGS well along the river. And then we've got these 3 Prop 68 wells that do not yet have minimum thresholds. So this is a hydrograph from the series monitoring well. In the spring of 2022, our water level was above the minimum threshold. And you can see the water levels are showing a seasonal fluctuation that have been relatively consistent over the last few years. This is a hydrograph for one of the monitoring wells within the city of Turlock. This is the Southwest Water Reservoir, MW 335. Spring water level, as you can see, is below the minimum threshold. And we have seen that the water level in this well has declined about 30 feet within the last year. So between spring 2021 and spring 2022, it's a decline of about 30 feet. This is the map for the Eastern Principal Aquifer. About 60% of the wells are below the minimum threshold in the Eastern Principal Aquifer. 6 wells were above, 9 wells were below. 1 well was not measured. That's this one here, ETS GSA 12. Again, this is the one with the casing collapse and the one that is going to be replaced. And 2 wells, 2 of the Prop 68 wells, MW 68B and 68C, don't have an MT yet. In the Eastern Principal Aquifer, this is ETS GSA 05. Water levels have only been measured since October 2020. This is one of the newer wells. There are a group of relatively new wells in the monitoring network. Based on the water levels that we've seen, we can see that there are seasonal fluctuations occurring. And in the spring of 2022, we are above the MT in this well. This is ETS GSA 06, just to the west of Rouse Lake. You can see there's a long-term declining trend in water levels in this well. We can see in the last few years, seasonal fluctuations are apparent because of the frequency of measurements that have been taken. And in the spring, we were below the MT, and we've been below the MT in this well since about June of 2020. Moving down a little bit to the southwest of that previous well to kind of the eastern part of the principal aquifer. This is ETS GSA 20. Water levels in this well have been measured since about fall of 2017. We're seeing declining trends with some seasonal fluctuations, and we've been below the MT since about April 2020. And so this is the map for interconnected surface water. There are 3 wells in the monitoring network along the San Joaquin River. They were all above the MT in spring 2022. There are 3 wells along the Tuolumne River. 2 of them were below the MT and 1 was above, and the 2 that were below are in the east, ETS GSA 01 and 02 on either side of Turlock Lake. And then along the Merced River, there are 5 wells in the monitoring network. 4 of them are below the MT, and those are within the East Turlock Subbasin GSA. So I will show you a hydrograph along each river. This is TID 63 along the San Joaquin River. The spring 2022 water level is above the MT, and we saw it recover about 11 feet since the fall. So it was below the MT in the fall of 2021, but here we are above the MT in the spring. This is ETS GSA 02, located just to the east of Turlock Lake. We see water level recovery quite a bit since June 2021. And in the spring of 2022, we're slightly below the MT, about 2 feet. And this is ETS GSA 17 along the Merced River. Water levels in this well have been measured since about October 2019, seeing a declining trend with some seasonal fluctuations, and our spring level is below the MT. So what does this all mean? Let's put this all in perspective. Yes, water levels are below the MTs in more than half of the representative monitoring wells in spring 2022. And water levels are continuing to decline because of the ongoing drought conditions. This was the first monitoring event since the GSP was submitted. Projects and management actions will need time to be implemented, and then will need time to have an effect on the water levels. There's only 1 well, TID 10, that is possibly at or below the IMs. And this is the one that was dry, so we're not exactly sure what the water level is. There are several wells that are within a few feet of the IMs. And we are currently in the process of developing an action plan regarding how to respond to the exceedance of MTs. But again, I just sort of the take-home message here is the spring 2022 MT exceedances do not count towards triggers for undesirable results. Again, undesirable results requires 3 consecutive fall measurements for chronic lowering of groundwater and 2 consecutive fall measurements for interconnected surface water. So moving on to the groundwater elevation contour maps that we developed from the measured data. They were developed from measured data at both the representative monitoring wells and also the Sigma wells. We developed maps in both the fall 2021 and spring 2022. And you'll see in each time period, we developed 1 map that includes wells in the western upper and eastern principal aquifers, and a separate map that includes wells in the western lower principal aquifer. And this is the map in fall 2021 for the western upper and eastern principal aquifers. Groundwater elevations range from 30 feet in the west at TID 63 to 144 feet at ETS GSA 02, right next to Turlock Lake. The center of the pumping depression is at about 10 feet below sea level. I've added arrows to this map just to help you understand where the direction of groundwater flow. And groundwater flow is towards the pumping depression in the eastern and also in the central subbasin. We have some northerly flow in the vicinity of Ceres and Modesto. And we also have a groundwater mound in the vicinity of Hillmar and Delhi, which extends north to the vicinity of Turlock and Denair. And from this mound, we have radial flow outwards in all 4 directions. And then in the western subbasin, we have flow to the west and northwest. In fall 2021, in the western lower principal aquifer, we don't have much data. We only have data from one well. That's the Denair monitoring well, NW11. So the water level, groundwater elevation in that well was 16 feet. Clearly, it's not enough to generate contours. And just to remind everyone, you know, the fall 2021 monitoring event occurred before the GSP was adopted and before the Prop 68 monitoring wells were installed. So you'll see in the spring 2022 map for the same aquifer, we have quite a bit more data. So then moving on to the spring 2022. This is the western upper and eastern principal aquifers. We have similar flow patterns as we did in the fall of 2021. Groundwater elevations range from about 36 feet in the west to 146 feet next to Turlock Lake. Within the center of the pumping depression, groundwater elevation was about 14 feet below sea level. And overall, we saw an increase in groundwater elevations from the fall to the spring, which is what we would expect and hope for, since the fall, the purpose of the fall event is to capture low water levels after irrigation season is complete, whereas the spring is supposed to capture high water levels right before the irrigation season begins. And when we looked at the wells that were on both the fall 2021 map as well as the spring 2022 map, we saw that in the eastern principal, overall groundwater elevations increased a little over a foot. Most of that increase was in the eastern principal aquifer, on average about 2.8 feet. And in the western upper principal aquifer, it was pretty stable. It just actually declined by 0.3 feet. But again, this is stable. And one difference we see from the fall to the spring on this map is just we have much more data in the east, which is great. We have more wells. And this, again, is the first GSP monitoring event. And so we're just getting a lot more data and we're getting a better picture of what's happening. And this is the map for the spring in the western lower principal aquifer. We've got data from 7 wells. It's still, limited. There are still data gaps here, and we are working actually on a separate project to site and design monitoring wells to fill data gaps throughout the subbasin. And as you probably know, the GSA submitted a grant application to DWR for implementation funding, and one of the projects that was requested funding for is to conduct the project where we would actually construct the monitoring wells that we're currently siting. So fingers crossed. So based on the limited data on this map, groundwater flow is to the northwest. There is a pumping depression around the city of Turlock. And one thing that wanted to point out is that between the spring 2021 and spring 2022, these 3 monitoring wells that are around Turlock, again, technically these 2 are within the city of Turlock. Whoops, sorry. And this one is in Denair. But these 3 wells had pretty sharp water level declines between 20 and 30 feet between spring 2021 and spring 2022. So I'm going to pass this off now to my colleague, Arden Wells, who will talk about our water quality analysis.
Thank you, Liz. So water year 2022 and this annual report is the first year that we've done the water quality analysis. So first I want to go through what are undesirable results for water quality. So the MT minimum threshold is a new first-time exceedance of an MCL in a potable supply well in the representative monitoring network. And we have a separate monitoring network for water quality that was established in the last annual report. It's different than the water level monitoring network. And then undesirable results occur if the MT results in a well owner's increase on operational costs and is caused by GSA management activities. And so this really means that it's kind of a 2-phase approach where we're first going to be looking at the concentrations during the past water year to see if any of the wells have a first-time exceedance of the MCL, if they're potable supply wells. And then we're going to look at those individual wells and We look at the concentrations over time and nearby water levels, among other factors, to consider if the increases in concentrations are due to GSA management activities. And so first, we established the baseline monitoring network in the previous annual report. So this consists of 345 wells, and all of these wells were monitored for the constituents of concern in water year 2021. And in total, there are 6 constituents of concern. We're looking at arsenic, nitrate, uranium, total dissolved solids, 123 TCP, and PCE concentrations. So for each of these constituents of concern, we identified the maximum concentrations in each of the wells in the monitoring network between 91 and 2021. And we're looking at the concentrations above the MCL. And then each year we're going to look at the concentrations of these constituents of concern and look at if there's a first-time exceedance of the MCL in any potable water supply wells. So the next slide discusses what we did this past water year. So for water year 2022, we downloaded data from the GAMMA database online on GeoTracker. These are all publicly available data. And we compared the concentrations from this water year to the baseline levels to see, are any of the wells having a first-time exceedance of the MCL? And for wells that we identified as having a first-time MCL exceedance, we then individually examined them to see if the increasing concentrations could be due to GSA management activities. And so for this annual report, we created 6 maps for the 6 constituents. And the maps are showing wells in each of the principal aquifers during water year 2022 and showing, are the water levels above the MCL? And if so, is it a first-time exceedance for these wells? So this map shows our monitoring network. And the gray dots are the monitoring wells that were not monitored in water year 2022. And the other dots are divided by aquifer. And so in water year 2022, there were 188 wells that were in the monitoring network. Now, most of these wells were municipal wells, some were domestic wells, and the municipal and domestic wells are the ones that we are considering as potable supply wells in our analysis. But we do also include some monitoring wells at regulated facilities in the baseline monitoring network. And even though those aren't, the undesirable results aren't really applicable for those wells because they aren't public supply wells, or they aren't potable supply wells, we do include discussion of them and include them in the maps in the annual reports, just so we can kind of keep tabs on what's going on with water quality in the subbasin. And so I'm not going to go through all 6 of the constituents of concern in this presentation, just to save us a little bit of time. But the spoiler alert is that nitrate is the only constituent of concern with a new first-time MCL exceedance. So I'm just going to walk through arsenic and nitrate as examples. So this is the map. These are the maps for arsenic. So in water year 2022, we had 53 monitoring wells in our representative monitoring well network for water quality that were sampled. And you can see on these 3 maps, we don't have any wells that are showing first-time MCL exceedances. So none of the wells are MTs. There aren't any undesirable results applicable for arsenic. But there are a few wells that are shown as yellow, and those are the wells that did have a concentration above the MCL, but it wasn't a first-time exceedance. So we aren't including that in undesirable results. And so next I'll show nitrate. And for nitrate, we had measurements in 174 of the monitoring wells in water year 2022. And out of these wells, 4 of the wells did have a concentration above the MCL for the first time. And 2 of these were representative two of these were monitoring wells at regulated facilities. And 2 of the wells were potable water supply wells that showed an MCL exceedance for the first time. So 2 MTs, these are the easternmost red dots that are shown on the maps. And so for these 2 wells, then we had to think about, well, are the increase in concentrations due to GSA management activities? So the first step in that is to look at, have the concentrations been increasing prior to the GSP implementation, prior to GSA management of the subbasin? So the well to the west is a public supply well in Houston. Yes, that well. And it has been showing increasing nitrate concentrations since 2017. But it was water year 2022 when the nitrate concentrations increased to greater than 10 milligrams per liter. And the well to the east is a domestic well, and monitoring began in 2019 for this well, and concentrations have been increasing since 2019. So concerning the concentrations over time, because they've been increasing prior to GSP adoption and GSA management activities beginning, it's unlikely that the concentrations have increased due to GSA management over the last few months because the implementation is so new. Another thing that we looked at for these wells are water levels over time. Thank you. So we looked at the closest water level monitoring well, and for both of these wells, it's TID 175. And so we have seen recent decreases in water levels in this well. In water year 2022, the water levels were beneath the MT. However, they were above the interim milestone. And so drawdown can influence concentrations. The vertical gradients may be drawing nitrate downward. However, the downward draw of nitrate may decrease as groundwater levels recover due to GSA or GSP implementation. And another factor to consider for these are that nitrate concentrations are primarily attributable to nitrate loading rates at the ground surface. And this is regulated under the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. So there are programs in place outside of the GSAs that are managing nitrates in the basin. So given these 2 wells being identified as not being undesirable results, but having recent increases above the MCL for the first time, we do suggest that monitoring for nitrate is continued in this area so that we can assess the future trends and figure out whether or not we see evidence that suggests that undesirable results are occurring in the future. So further monitoring, especially in this area for nitrate, is highly encouraged. And
can I ask a quick question? Do we also put in there a paragraph about our coordination with existing programs that address nitrates? I mean,
yes.
You mentioned ILRP, but okay.
Yes, thank you. There is mention of coordination in the annual report as well as in the GSP.
Okay, thank you, Arden.
Thank you.
I will continue on just a couple more slides. So as part of the annual report, we provided an update on subsidence throughout the subbasin. The subsidence data that we looked at in water year 2022 is based on INSAR vertical displacement data that is published by DWR. Throughout the subbasin, as you can see by this light orange color and the slightly darker orange color, there is some minor negative vertical displacement between about 0 and 0.1 feet or 0 and 1.2 inches. The highest rates were in the western subbasin in this area, the darker orange, and the lighter orange is less rates. And in the very eastern subbasin, this gray color, it's actually positive vertical displacement, meaning showed that ground surface elevations rose, but it could be also measurement error where it's unclear. But the take, I'm sorry. The take home message here is that the subsidence that was indicated during water year 2022 is consistent with historical rates. So,
Does
yes.
that factor in any error in the NSTAR data itself?
Yeah, there
Is it?
is. Yes, there is error. Error is smaller than the change that we're seeing. So the negative vertical displacement data that was measured, that was indicated, cannot be totally covered by the error bar. But there is error. Yes.
Thank you.
So schedule. We are almost at the end of the road. We have submitted a draft report to the GSAs. They have provided comments. We have responded to comments, and the GSAs are currently reviewing our response to those comments and looking at sort of final revisions. We are hoping and expecting to finish the annual report and provide it to the tax by the end of this week. And we will be submitting this to DWR next week. It's due on April 1st. And that is it. I appreciate all of you hanging in there. We totally understand how much we just threw at you. So please let us know if you have any questions or if there's anything you want to discuss. Thanks again.
Thank you, Liz, Dominic, and the rest of the team. Are there any questions for the consultants? I think for me, it's hard to start implementing a GSP in the middle of a drought. So, and I think that was reflected in some of the information there, but hopefully, obviously this year's a better year and some of the projects and programs we're working on will help us move us in a more positive direction, but it's always tough to get off to a difficult start. But anyway, that's not the consultant's fault. That is what it is. So thanks for representing the information in an interesting manner and fairly.
And Michael, I'll just mention too, like from somewhat of an outsider's perspective, technical team, this annual report, at least this presentations, it seems like it's a big deal to me in terms of, the way things look from an outsider's perspective, because it's first real, there was 3 months after we submitted our GSP when we had our first annual report. This is the first real chance between the GSP being submitted, DWR's determination, and what we've done in the middle. And we have real information about how we're doing against the MTs, how things are doing with water quality. It shows forward progress. And so like my eyes are somewhat opened, even as kind of an insider, still being a technical outsider, thankfully. But it's a big deal to me. It's the type of thing where it shows our progress. And then the big kicker will be what happens upon GSP determination and how that affects things. But in terms of annual report, there's a lot we could pull from this to show progress towards objectives. So that's just my take.
Well done. So with that, you making a motion to approve the submittal of the annual report?
I haven't made a motion ever. I always look to Debbie.
This is an action item. We do need to get this report into DWR very shortly. It's still some things to button up on it, but so I would ask that we, at least in the West Turlock GSA TAC, adopt a motion or recommending submittal of the second GSP annual report for water year 2022 and submit that to DWR. If we have any further concerns or changes we'd like to make.
And I'd advance the motion. Be nice to get on the record.
There you go.
Yeah.
But the minutes so reflect. Look smart. TID makes a motion. Do we have a second? On the West Turlock, this is.
I'll second.
Thank you. We have a second from there. All those in, any further discussion? Those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Wonderful. That'll move ahead. So Sarah, over to you on the East Turlock.
So the East Turlock would needs to make a motion to approve this annual report as well so that we can get it submitted. So can I get a motion from East Turlock?
Wait, the motion.
Thank you, Matt. A second.
Second.
Thanks, Lacey. So any other comments or questions? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries and we can advance it.
Great. Okay, moving on to item number 7, and I do have to be downstairs at 4 o'clock for another meeting, but someone can take over from me. I don't think I have any more action items on the agenda. But item number 7 is the round 2 multi-benefit land repurposing grant program. It's a briefing regarding the East Turlock GSA's application, which we did take to the board last week due to timing snafus. It's been reviewed by the West Turlock board, but over to Mike and Sarah for information.
So I will be merciful and not go through any slides. I'll just briefly give the background. This is a $40 million grant program. It's in its second year of implementation by the Department of Conservation. They issue block grants. They like to focus on 10 million. The idea is that grantees will develop a multi-benefit agricultural land repurposing plan, conduct permitting and design for projects to implement that land repurposing. There are payments. It's usually a cost sharing agreement for specific projects. And then support for collaborators to develop regional capacity for these kinds of projects, community outreach, and then monitoring. ETS GSA has decided to take the lead since we have a management action by implementing for land fallowing or repurposing. We are looking for various different partners. That's one of the key review criteria is that you come across with strong partnerships to help implement this program and build capacity in the region. So WTS GSA graciously decided to team with us on that. We very much appreciate that. Our other partners that we're seeking are Merced County, Stanislaus County, Turlock Irrigation District, California Farmland Trust. We're also talking to Sustainable Conservation, Sand Creek Flood Control District, and then we plan to talk to Merced RCD and possibly Stanislaus RCD. All these various partners have various different responsibilities and interests that overlap with our interest of sustainable groundwater management. The fact is that we cannot really have land retirement or land repurposing as a part of our portfolio without meeting other objectives. At the top of the list is a viable agricultural economy. And having multiple benefits such as flood control and developing habitat are key, we think, in terms of making something like this successful. So those are key themes that we're hitting in our application. The application is due on March 29th. So obviously we're not hitting those themes with a lot of words. We're trying to be very focused in our submittal. It's a very competitive grant program. So it remains to be seen if we're successful. We felt like we owe it to ourselves to try, and at the very least, it helps us get themes and relationships developed that we will move forward on in the future. Are there any questions, comments? Okay.
I think Sarah, you have some experience with this grant before.
Yes, so I've applied for one of these grants. I'm also on the committee that gives guidance to Department of Conservation on how to administer this grant. And Madera County, where I do some work, received one of these block grants last year, and they're just beginning their rollout of meeting with the partners and starting to formulate their plans on how those partners will engage in the subbasin. But it's really, I think, a unique opportunity to get planning dollars that are often not available to help all of us figure out what these plans would look like, how we engage with different interest groups for land repurposing.
Wonderful. I don't know if Debbie have anything to add, but we did take this to the West Turlock Board last week, and that was my decision, so I take the blame for that. But because we need a letter of support from the board. And obviously this meeting's this week, so the timing was off. We couldn't make a recommendation from the TAC, but what East Turlock is trying to do is entirely consistent with the GSP. It furthers GSP implementation. Very supportive of their efforts, and made that comment to the chair. I think when he asked what the TAC's thought was, I said, well, we haven't met, but this is entirely in line with what we're trying to do in GSP implementation. Anything else, Debbie?
No.
You took your mask off, so I figured you had something to say there.
I was gonna say what you just said.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
All right. Thank you. I'm sorry for stealing your thunder.
no worries.
So Michael, did WTS GSA approve moving forward with the support, even though the TAC had not been able to
Correct.
get on it yet? Okay.
Yes, they did. It's one of those, usually it's the opposite. We take an action here, that have to go back to the board to get, post hoc approval, and this was the other way around. So.
Well, and they do give a very short time frame. I believe the grant regs came out a month and a half ago, not very long ago. It was very recent. And so it's a pretty quick turnaround, but it is also a very simplistic grant to some degree.
Okay.
So hopeful that we can be successful.
Yeah, good luck. Any questions from the group for that grant? Thanks for taking the lead on that. Okay, I'll hand over to Karen. Take my spot. Thank you, Karen.
You have to leave?
Yeah, I got a meeting at 4 downstairs. I'll turn into a pumpkin if I don't make it. And there's no more action other than adjourning. So it's Sigma updates. Take it away. Thank you.
Okay, so we have our Sigma updates. Debbie and Herb.
I'll just mention briefly and then I'll yield to Debbie. Just on the communication front, I'm just intrigued and prompted by the presentation that was just given in the annual report to find a way to package up some of that information that's beneficial to our messaging and send that out alongside our social media and our email distribution list. And so I'm pondering ways just right now during this meeting to do that. So that's something that we can look forward to moving. Another thing too, and this is the last item I would mention, is trying to find some sort of way within our current budget to spare some $200 on an annual basis if possible. So I'm putting that out to the group for potential thoughts moving forward or any red flags to pay $200 annually for website translation. Our current website is still functional and it functions well, but it is only in English. And of course, with the 2020 census being conducted, it's shown what a lot of us know, that English is not necessarily the primary language spoken in a great percentage of households in our two counties. So looking at a way to quickly and seamlessly have that integrated into our website for a relatively low cost compared to some other things we do for $200 annually. So not necessarily looking for authorization or anything like that, but I wanted to put that number out there one more time, potentially before we meet again in April, to see if that's a way I could talk to Michael Clipper and see if we can get some allowance that still fits in with our dues and if there's any sort of money there. So just a thought, we could sit on that, but I wanted to put that out there. Unless there's any questions, that's all I have on the communication front.
Thank you.
Okay, I just had a couple comments or updates on the consolidated final PEIR. The West Turlock GSA certified the final PEIR last week. And I believe East Turlock is set to consider it this week.
Yes.
And then next joint TAC meeting, which Jennifer is, I believe it's April 11th. April 11th.
Yeah, it's the 11th.
It's the 11th. Perfect. Yes, thank you.
Just put it on the website.
Perfect. We will be having a workshop with ESA, which was our consultant for the PEIR, kind of working through how to use it for the various projects and management actions And if you all recall, within the GSP, there's a variety of projects and management actions that are covered under that consolidated final PEIR. And some of those projects and management actions are activities that the GSAs may be doing, but some of them are projects that have proponent agencies. And so the agencies within the GSAs have projects that could be implemented under that PEIR and can make use of the work that was done by the GSAs to move those analyses for those projects forward. And so the meeting will talk through kind of how to make use of the consolidated PEIR for all of these different projects and management actions. So plug for the next meeting. We're also working on coordinating the spring monitoring event. We're scheduled to have it done by April 15th, I believe. And so we'll be doing those measurements in the next few weeks and then reporting them as required. And then we are wrapping up the existing grants that we have. I think all of the work is required to be done by April 30th, and then we'll be doing all of the reporting and what have you on those over the next couple months. So, and we don't expect to hear back on the grant application that we submitted back in December until August, I believe. So that's the latest on that. Any questions?
Okay, well, that leads us to our next meeting, the next regular joint technical advisory.
Aaron?
Yes,
So ETS GSA has
so sorry.
a quick update. I'll try to make this short. I just wanted to give some highlights of our schedule. So we develop a 6-month forward-looking schedule that I try to update monthly. So and I just updated it. And so rising to the top of that agenda is development of a fiscal year 23-24 budget. So we expect to be collaborating with WTS GSA to make sure that our activities and our budgets are aligned. And we're looking to move that forward in later this month into April and adopting it in May, hopefully. And that converges with a number of other things. So we have, you mentioned the monitoring. We're looking at repurposing some of our TSS wells. So these are wells that are paid for by DWR to install them for us in the subbasin. We'll be looking at installing those near the rivers and at the interface between the eastern and western principal aquifers to help address some of those data gaps we discussed today. The projects we're moving forward in terms of discussions regarding readiness for receiving replenishment water, surplus water, if that's made available by TID this year. We're ready for it, and then moving into phase 2 of that study to see how it can be augmented and expanded. We had a workshop earlier this month on pumping management framework, and we'll be moving into a pilot program for pumping management. We've developed a portal. Right now we have roughly 10 different parties that have agreed to participate in that pilot program. There may be more that come out of the woodwork in the next week or so. And then we'll be getting that pilot program that's going to move towards virtual program for the whole basin by the end of the year. And then an actual program and a fee structure with extractions that we're looking to implement. Currently, the target that for that would be the 2024 irrigation season. And the other kind of critical items are the MLRP grant application, and then moving forward with the budgeting process and then looking forward to making sure that we anticipate hearing the news on our Sigma grant and on MLRP grant by late summer. So those are the highlights.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No.
Go ahead, Karen. Sorry.
Anybody have anything else? Our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, April 11th. That's correct, right, Jennifer?
Yes.
Okay. And here again, in person? Okay. With that, I'll take a motion for adjournment. Thank you, Miguel.
I'll second.
Okay, second. Any further discussion? In favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Nay. Right, motion carries.
Like, second.
That was, it's a team.
That's right.
You guys have worked together before.
That's right. Yeah. At the end of the day, especially, you know. Done.